Um, okay. If I'm gonna be recorded, I gotta turn on my lights to make myself look pretty. That is, I think, working. Cool. I'll take POIs verbally. Unmute, say POI. I'm not gonna be looking at chat. If you offer a POI through chat and I don't take it, you'll be sad. So unmute, say POI. I'll probably ask for one, probably from closing at around 5:30. So you'll almost certainly hear a lot of conflicting characterization as to what political crime looks like from either side of the house. But to establish some common ground and like start with some things that I think are relatively uncontentious between all teams within the brand, I think a couple of things. The first way in which I foresee this national referendum working is it probably just works off of a majority vote. I think that it is oftentimes a two-thirds majority is probably going to be too difficult to attain, given that it is like the margins in a lot of democracies. Sorry, a lot of democracies that are really sophisticated end up being like 55 to like 45, like those are the splits. That's why it doesn't work okay with going for a simple majority. The second is that it is that I think that these are political, like these political crimes are often crimes that have corresponding charges that are particularly restrictive and punitive. So treason, sedition, and espionage, these are crimes that if it is that you are convicted of them, you get hit with corresponding punishments like execution, lifetime imprisonment, like the prevention of you from ever seeking office or elected office again, bans from you appearing in public media. I think that it is that these are crimes that specifically because it is that they have such a high burden of proof and because it is that they're perceived to be so especially egregious, they have corresponding punishments that are particularly restrictive in ways in which other crimes probably are not. On the characterization of political crimes that it is that you'll hear from government, we'll contend that it is that I think prosecutors often seek charges of sedition, treason, espionage, or whatever, when it is that they are seeking to actively silence or repress mechanisms through which governments are held accountable. So in these instances, I think that it's actively against the interests of the public, and as far as it is that it deprives them of the opportunity to, have governments that are held accountable, to have governments that are able to be influenced through their own agency, but also in instances where it is that it affects the balance of powers, and as far as it is that like there's no longer organized political opposition that it is that they could vote for, or in the cases of like Alexei Navalny in Russia before when it is that he was imprisoned off of charges like treason and espionage, or in other instances of like journalistic whistleblowing like Julian Assange, who is like the co-founder of WikiLeaks. He hosted and posted whistleblown information regarding civilian death and like U.S. military drone strikes in the Middle East, and he's now being hit with like charges of treason, and he's seeking asylum in other countries that like won't extradite him to the U.S. I think that it is that these are the instances in which you'll oftentimes see people pursue these political crimes. From up, what you're probably going to hear is that it is that the acts that get hit with political crime charges are just like really fucking egregious, and that it is that because it is that they're so egregious that there shouldn't be this sort of potentiality that it is that people who do things that are so terrible for the state to be pardoned and let set free. And I'm not going to do their job for them. Like I'll let them illustrate what it is that this potentially looks like, but I think that I'll give you some reason as to why it is that this characterization is generally just like likely. So in instances where it is that there's just like a very egregious like miscarriage of justice that needs to be prosecuted, given that it is that like I think that these political crimes are one, charges that just intrinsically have a higher burden of proof because it is that they correspond to more punitive, more restrictive punishments as to the people that get convicted of them. And two, oftentimes these are charges that in like the legal, these are charges that have a lack of legal precedent. So it is like whatever decision that it is that the courts end up making, they have to like seriously contend and seriously contemplate whether or not this is like a good decision. They can't just rely off of like established precedent because it is that there isn't a comparable analog. Like the last time that it is a charges of sedition and treason were prosecuted was in like the 1920s at the end of World War One, or like at the time of the Civil War. That's just like not comparable in modern politics or contemporary politics right now to like modern charges of like whistleblowing or whatever that are caused from like leaks of like classified information or like the organization of political opposition. I don't think that it is they're oftentimes analogs. And so in instances where it is that there is truly such a like egregious miscarriage of justice, what I think oftentimes happens is that it is prosecutors will just instead like compromise and choose to pursue lesser charges that have lower burdens of proof to ensure that it is that they can secure a conviction, but charges that still nonetheless cumulatively when added together are able to achieve the end impact of like preventing people who might harm democracy from being able to participate within that system again. I think that that is how it is that we're probably going to deal with it. Like I think that it is that like in the US, the DOJ is just going to prosecute people who have done really shady shit for lesser crimes with lower burdens of proof to make those charges stick and to secure like convictions with greater amounts of certainty. I think that this okay, so yeah, I think that it is that ultimately then, like when it is that we're talking mostly about, instances wherein where we're seeking to charge people, sorry, in instances where it is that we're seeking to charge, people that are participating in journalistic whistleblowing or they're organizing like legitimate political opposition. In those instances where it is that I think you'll probably hear political crimes hit. The thing that it is that you'll probably hear is like, okay, well, in these instances where it is the government is just so like blatantly and so blatantly corrupt, and it is that there's probably not like a lot of separation of power. It is that there's probably on some level some like capture by the state of like the judiciary. That means that it is that prosecutors are going to be aligned with government incentives, and they're going to want to like seek out to prosecute the political enemies of the current administration. The question then is like, well, how does this presumably help? And I think the way in which like having a national referendum is that there is now the optionality for people that are hit with these sorts of charges to be like pardoned and to be allowed to like do whatever if it is that there is enough contention within the public that it is that they're actually like legitimate and it is that they're actually capable or whatever. So I'll take a POI at this time if any team has one.
Yeah, sure. There are many crimes that have the death penalty, and there are many crimes that's subjective. Should all of those criminals also be entitled to a referendum on which they might be acquitted?
Yeah, so I think that it is that like this is something that it is that you're going to have to do substantial burden fulfillment on, given that I don't think that the EIB just necessarily agrees that like there is a crime that it is that should correspond to the death penalty. But the second thing that it is that I want to point out regarding this is just that it isn't like not across all countries are the laws the same. Like it is that certain countries have political philosophies or judicial philosophies that push for the death penalty while it is that others don't. I don't think that it is like other crimes. Like I don't think that many democracies in these days, Western liberal democracies, developed ones or progressive ones, are actively seeking the death penalty. And other than instances like this, I think that it is that these are why it is that these political tribes or these political crimes are particularly punitive. Going back to what it is that I was saying earlier then. So effectively, when it is that there is a mechanism through which, people could potentially escape, punishment by the state, that it is that this imposes a chilling effect on government and it makes them think as to what other charges that it is that they could possibly hit them both. And in instances where it is that we're talking about journalistic whistleblowing or like the organization of political opposition, I think that it is that the charges that it is that you could go for are generally going to be harder to find, they're going to be harder to prove, they're going to be more difficult to prosecute. But even in instances where it is that this isn't the case, I think the unique benefit that it is that we get on our side of the house is the punishments or the penalties that get affiliated with the individuals that may or may not get these charges that get stuck to them. They're just less punitive. So it is that Julian Assange doesn't fucking die if he goes back to the States. Alexei Navalny doesn't get in prison forever. That's to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for the fine speech. I'd now like to invite the LO.
Oh, just confirming that I'm audible.
Yep.
Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. If there was a groundswell of public sympathy for Edward Snowden, he would have likely received a presidential pardon on either side. If that sympathy did not exist, then it's unlikely that a public referendum would have exonerated him either. Which explains, this debate is not about political crimes committed by small fry. This debate is about egregious political crimes committed by political elites, who would be punished in our world, but in their world is conflated by the fact that these political elites justify their crimes on the basis of their popularity. Like Bolsonaro's attempt to overturn the electoral results of 2020. Like Trump's attempt to overturn the elections of 2020 by putting pressure on Georgia electors to find him 50,000 votes. Two arguments from opening opposition. Firstly, in principle, the prosecution of political crimes ought be insulated from political will. Secondly, in practice, these referenda are more likely to pervert the course of justice rather than rectify it. First, on the principle, I want to begin by noting that there are a set of rights that are so fundamental to Western liberal democracies, such that they supersede other rights and even the iteration of these rights themselves. For instance, we would all believe that people have a unilateral right to vote, and that right to vote for everyone supersedes the fact that even if some people, like say the majority, use their right to vote to strip the right of vote of others, we would not deem that to be a necessary and acceptable form of that democratic will. So they are a set of rights that should be fundamentally protected. Second premise is that these political crimes are crimes that are defined on the basis that they thwart those fundamental rights, like overturning a democratic election, like, for instance, engaging in sedition, treason, breach of state sovereignty, breach of state government security, and our fundamental right of these people to be secure. So, the upshot of all of that should explain to you that these prosecutions should be immunized from the political will, because it is precisely the political will that is the threat here. The key thing to understand is that the only reason why political elites would go to such lengths to commit such brazen crimes is if they believed that they had sufficient popular backing to justify doing those crimes, which is precisely why Trump did it, because he believed that the MAGA heads would be in support of it, which is why Bolsonaro did it, which is why dictators that have thwarted democracy have done so in the past on the perceived backing of democratic legitimacy. Why then ought this be a decision that is entirely in the hands of the courts rather than the populace? Firstly, because courts are bound to merely make decisions on the basis of facts. Voters are not bound to make their decisions on any one basis. They're likely to base it on their political preferences, which is wrong. Secondly, we would note that in this case, this is not a decision of morality where democracy might be relevant. It's a decision that requires technocratic expertise. Did this certain crime meet a violation of the constitutional threshold or did it not? Which explains to you why subjective moral preferences are not relevant. This is a legal question. Lastly, we will note that in many cases, democracy is not absolute, which is essentially the basis of opening government's claim. Like, it's the reason why we don't allow voters just to decide matters of law. It's why we have courts. It's why most countries have a constitution. Those constitutional protections are put in place precisely to protect voters from themselves, to protect distortions of democratic will that undermine the existence and essence of the democratic will itself. How should you weigh this argument in the debate? 3 ways. Firstly, you either believe this is an absolute principle, which means that opening opposition have already won this debate. At the very least, secondly, it places a very, very high bar from opening government, especially as our POI indicates. Their argument is an argument for the political will to exonerate any potential crime. We've explained why this particular crime should be precisely immunized from that level of political discretion. Thirdly, we've explained that this is a decision that precisely voters do not have expertise in. It's where their subjective moral preferences are irrelevant. It's where their legal expertise or their lack thereof means that they are likely to make decisions badly. And fourthly, it obviously creates a moral hazard because in a world where people could potentially get away with doing crimes because they would have those crimes be overturned by a simple majority, they were more likely to do it in the first place, which is what created that moral hazard, which is why that principle also had practical implications in this debate. Secondly, I'm going to deal with opening government's best case and explain that on a probabilistic basis, this referenda is more likely to pervert courses of justice rather than rectify it. Before that, closing.
You attempted to characterize this, but we still question why will the majority of voters want to pardon a treasonous politician if they already see how egregious those crimes are towards the
They don't see how egregious those crimes are because they fall for populist rhetoric, because they fall for strongman authoritarian figures, which is precisely how most democracies are undermined. Bolsonaro, Trump, Hitler, his history just refutes your claim. It's based on perception, which is precisely what leads voters astray. Why is this more likely to be a perversion? On 2 grounds. First, on ease of manipulation, which is to say that a court of law is less likely to be manipulated by political elites than a court of political opinion, for 2 reasons. Firstly, judges are more likely to be impartial. Yes, they may say that they might be appointed by political elites, but that is a cross-vetting process, which means that by mutually assured destruction, that often cancels out. Judges on a relative basis are more likely to be impartial than an electorate, which is inherently much more politically biased. Secondly, and more crucially, judges are more likely to be informed, and we've already explained to you why this is a decision where that degree of information and legal expertise matters. Secondly, these decisions are more likely to be overturned. Opening government have established a model that this requires a simple majority, which means that it's far easier to influence than, say, the very complex layers that every judicial decision can go through, which is why it's more likely to be distorted in ways that are quite bad. Secondly, it means that in cases of simple majority, the key deciding factor are swing voters. It's the marginal 1% that's likely to determine the 51% outcome to the 49% outcome. So that means these decisions are likely to be volatile and therefore more likely to be manipulated by the most extreme voters, by the voters who are, most volatile. So Next thing I want to say is that for the set of crimes they are talking about, like Edward Snowden, like people who might have done something for the greater good of the state, there are a whole bevy of other alternatives that suggest they would have gotten appealed anyway, so this is not the debate. There are 4 of them. Firstly, prosecutors have discretion on which crimes to prosecute in the first instance, and they're unlikely to go for those set of crimes precisely because it takes a lot of time to prosecute and because the public might, perceive that to be unfair, which is why prosecutors don't do it. Secondly, even if it gets to court, there's a jury system, which means that juries can nullify it. They can just say who's not guilty. It's because they believe that the principle of the law is itself invalid, like the principle of the law is itself unjust. Thirdly, judges also have sentencing discretion for that precise reason. And fourthly, pardons and amnesty are likely to be put in place. The reason why political crimes especially are likely to go through all those checks and balances is because they are especially high profile. They are likely to face the most scrutiny from the public and from the government, which is why these are crimes that have gone through all those proper checks and balances. This debate is only about the bad ones. For those reasons, we are proud to oppose.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to thank the
Sorry,
I'd like to thank the speaker. I'd like to thank the speaker for the fine speech. I'd now like to invite the DPM.
Okay. Thank you. I'll take POIs in the chat only, please. Please do not interrupt me. I will get distracted, and that's not good. I think it's a bit unfortunate that in this round, the two most well-known examples, like Trump, or the main well-known example, like Trump, is a case where probably somebody has actually committed a major crime. But the actual cases where this activates across the world are probably mostly cases where a ruling elite in a pseudo-democratic country pushes certain legal changes or pushes certain changes that mean that you're actually going to prevent the ability of dissidents or opposition to enact their will. Like, look at Venezuela, look at Bolivia, look at the imprisoning of Lula in Brazil. There are many, many different cases, which are, I think, far more partial to our side, even if we grant them Trump, which we think is unlikely. Okay, so a few things in this speech then. First of all, let's talk about why we think that there's likely to be a lot of false prosecution. Second of all, why we think that you're still going to prosecute the right people, a bunch of refutation, and then an additional principal argument on why we think that this does not meet the burdens necessary to prosecute people. First of all, we think that oftentimes there's a massive bias within the intelligence and national security establishment that makes them want to protect each other. To the extent you see each other as government workers and judges see, for example, the NSA as government workers, note that they're like in the US, for example, secret councils or secret courts where the judges are incredibly partial to the NSA because they've worked together for a long amount of time. That means judges in even relatively democratic countries are often going to unreasonably rule in favor of the national security establishment. Additionally, also, So I think this just means that in many cases you have illegitimate prosecution, or at least prosecution that is not in the public's interest. But second of all, the implication of this is that often those who are prosecuted are those who have the least power. Op is super uncharitable, when they're like, oh, look, it's super powerful dictators who are mostly going to get prosecuted here. That's false, because if somebody's a really successful and powerful dictator, like, for example, Maduro in Venezuela, then it's likely that they've already captured the judiciary, so therefore it's unlikely that they're going to get prosecuted in the first place. The question then is largely political dissidents, those who are fighting against the dictatorial regime or semi-dictatorial regime, who are the tipping point in this debate. Okay. Op has a few pushes then. First of all, they tell us that there's going to be that dictators do things with a lack of legitimacy, with the perception of public support, and they're more likely to do anti-democratic things. Two things. One, I already analyzed to you, if it is true that dictators have this degree of power, then they probably already use that to manipulate courts. It's unclear why the courts are much better. But second of all, dictators are highly irrational. Note that just because they think that, I think that lots of dictators throughout history have imagined that they're going to cause a general popular uprising. And so I'm not sure why the tipping point for a crazed dictator who thinks that the people are all going to support their crazy actions is a popular vote rather than just an overthrowing of the governmental system, which is probably what they already believe in. Additionally, on manipulation, I think there are multiple problems with this argument. The biggest one is that they say that it's they just assert that it's easier to manipulate the popular vote than elected officials. That's false. It's much easier to do things like send money to one judge to bribe them to do a certain thing. It's much easier to replace judges or do certain official acts rather than have to change the entire population's will. Lastly, there's this claim on inalienable rights. One, I think that they're missing the burden of this debate because the burden is largely not about the inalienable rights, but whether or not they're in fact violated. I gave you reasons above why the national security establishment is likely to, in many cases, falsely imprison or falsely accuse people of crimes, even if there's not factual basis for them, because they're interested in self-protection and because they're oftentimes highly corrupt in pseudo-democratic states. But additionally, I think even if it's true that there's some violation of rights, we think it is fair that people are able to be the ones who choose to trade off the rights themselves. Note that their example of weighing is actually a great example of this. There's a reason why we give electoral groups the ability to decide what types of ID requirements and governance requirements for elections are required, because when people decide like things like the security of election, they are trading off a right to accessibility of voting versus a right to reliability of voting. That's the type of trade-off that I think the average citizen should be allowed and empowered to make. Okay, let's talk about why we think that it's unlikely that people who are really criminal are actually going to get away with it for free. One, I think Simon already tells you that people who are truly criminal probably committed other crimes. Why? Because crimes beget crimes. In order to get money to bribe people, you probably need to launder that money because you're not going to show it through official sources. To do things like massively anti-democratic reforms, you oftentimes have to do bribery, you oftentimes have to do things like threats, etc. This means that there are oftentimes a myriad of smaller crimes which are not subject to this, which are also true. Note that this is asymmetric with people who are actually innocent, because people who are actually innocent did not need to resort to things like money laundering and bribery, so as a result, they're less likely to get prosecuted. Note that I think that a lot of the judicial systems are like not completely corrupt, or at least there's a degree to which they're going to look more crazy if they accuse somebody falsely, like very clearly falsely with no evidence of something like money laundering, rather than things like treason, which Simon already explained to you is relatively vague, oftentimes have vague wording like actions against the state. And so as a result, people who are innocent can get convicted of treason, but not money laundering. People who are guilty are probably convicted of both. And so at least you're able to sentence them on either side of the house. But additionally, some analysis on why voters are likely to vote correctly. I think we don't have to prove that voters are always going to choose correctly as to who's guilty and who's not. We just have to prove that they're going to be more liable on average than oftentimes politically stacked judges in countries like Venezuela, where the dictator can just choose an entire seat of Supreme Court justices. Two reasons then. One, there's likely to be a high degree of public education to the extent that public referendums like these are oftentimes big deal. They're covered in international press and local press, and people oftentimes have a relatively diverse media diet if they choose. Note that people who live under dictatorships know that they can't trust the dictatorship media, and so as a result, they're relatively likely to be able to do things like go online. They can like get VPNs, read external sources to try to understand whether or not the person that they're interested in has actually committed the crime. But second of all, people are oftentimes actually motivated by good things. Note that I think that, for example, the election of Lula or the massive success of the Venezuelan opposition recently shows that the average person in semi-dictatorial societies or semi-democratic societies wants to push for more democracy. And so as a result, it's highly likely that they're going to not do things like pardon people who've committed major crimes. I'll take the POI right now.
Yeah, you strawman our case to be about dictatorships. Our case is about democracy sliding towards authoritarianism because people want authoritarianism, but an independent judiciary can safeguard against it.
Yeah, the point is that in many cases, the judiciary is not that independent. Even in the US, Trump has been able to appoint like 3 Supreme Court justices. Do we really expect them to be extremely impartial for somebody who gave them a job of a lifetime? Okay, lastly, Op has this argument that people are just super biased on politics. Note that I think that there's often another candidate of the same ideology who you can agree with politically who doesn't have the same sort of baggage. And so even if you choose to like let that candidate fall to the wayside because they did something anti-democratic, you have other options. The principle then is quite simple. We observe that the reason why we imprison people in status quo is threefold. One, it's oftentimes retribution. Two, it's to separate them from society to prevent recommitting. And three, it's to deter future committing of crimes. But note that for the average crime, they're actually victims who have these rights like retribution, etc. But in the case where it's an action against the public, we think that there's only the public that can count. The reason that the public matters is that the state is not a moral actor on its own. Note that to the extent that the public denies that there's a crime against them, and they probably have the best epistemic access to their own state, and they also know the news in general, they are able to say that there has been no crime committed. If there's no crime committed, there's no justification for retribution, deterrence, or separating them from the public, which means that there's no justification for locking them up. So proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for the fine speech. I'd now like to invite the dialogue.
I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about what kinds of crime are this debate actually about. Secondly, why voters lack the right to be able to acquit people of these crimes. And thirdly, why practically this will be devastatingly bad. Let's start with what types of crimes this debate is about, because I think we give you a very clear conception of the most important cases this debate is about. It's things like January 6th or Bolsonaro's coup. It's attempts by politicians to overturn the political system itself and subvert the rights of every single voter within those countries. These are clearly the most important cases and the most egregious cases you should care about. Opening government's push is to say this debate is actually about people who haven't committed political crimes, but whom are falsely accused of political crimes, where this is a tactic used by governments to go after their opposition. There are a couple of reasons why this is either unimportant or untrue within the debate. The first thing we'd point out is that within most functioning political systems that are democratic, you're very unlikely to bring false charges against your political opposition for political crimes, because the voters will see through this. You'll look very bad for doing so, and you're likely to lose elections and lose power if, for example, you go after your opposition. Which is why, for example, Joe Biden has been so reluctant to support prosecutions against Donald Trump, someone who literally did commit devastatingly bad political crimes. So you would have to believe that they would be even more reluctant to manufacture fake political crimes against Republicans who have not in fact committed them in the first place. That seems very unlikely. Secondly, if you believe opening government's characterization that the instances where this occurs is in authoritarian states to begin with, then that is precisely the context in which this debate has no impact, because these governments are more than willing to just ignore the effects of elections, are more than capable of rigging elections, and are more than capable of engaging in huge amounts of state propaganda in order to secure the results that they want. Which is why, for example, Vladimir Putin wins election after election and would easily be able to win the election to set Navalny free and then talk about how he has state endorsement, an endorsement from the Russian people to have Navalny executed. Because instead of giving Navalny a trial where he could at least make a case for why he is innocent and has not violated the letter of the law, instead the public signs his death warrant and he's dealt with far sooner and far more devastatingly, and in a way that has a far more discrediting effect on his ideology than would occur in the alternative. But even for someone like Julian Assange or Edward Snowden, they would be far better off in the courtroom where they're able to make cases as to why they have not violated the law than in the court of public opinion. Like, the US public was so, anti-Snowden and was calling for him to be, lynched. The idea that they would ever vote to acquit him, considering huge amounts of state propaganda that calls him treasonous, just as Fox News and other large media outlets pile on board and tell people that these people are evil and need to go down, suggests exactly why that is unlikely. Contrast that to a world in which they at least have the checks and balances of courts with independent judiciaries, of juries who might choose to acquit them, and of things like making numerous appeals, of applying for things like presidential pardons. Obviously, they're far better off on the side where you have checks and balances than on the side where the court of public opinion is the only check and balance, and it's one that is far more easily subverted by evil governments. That explains why opening government falls out of the debate, because their harms either do not accrue or they accrue symmetrically. Let's now talk about the cases that opening opposition describes, because they're far more important. The first and most useful argument we make is just to explain that the fact that a majority of voters want something to happen is not in all cases a sufficient justification for that thing to happen. Obviously, within democratic systems, we recognize that some policy should be decided on the basis of majoritarianism. We recognize that many things are off limits to the majority, which is why, for example, we don't have direct democracies in most countries, which is why we have things like constitutions, judges, central banks, and various other aspects of governance that fall outside the ambit of the majority to decide. For example, Speaker, we would not believe it is legitimate for a majority of voters to decide that black voters should be disenfranchised and denied the right to vote, even though a majority of voters democratically decided that that was legitimate, because we recognize that those rights supersede the rights of majorities to determine what should happen. Individual freedoms, individual political rights, and the makeup of our political system itself are more important than the right of people to determine policy, because they undergird the rights of they undergird all other rights that people need have access to. And we point out that the context in which this debate becomes very important is when politicians use this to subvert those checks and balances. When a politician is impeached for violating the Constitution, they can now get 50% of the population on board in order to get away with that crime, when otherwise existing checks and balances would have gotten rid of them and protected democracy. So the context of democratic backsliding is precisely where this debate is incredibly important. It's places like Poland or Hungary or under like Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, as side-opening government wants to point to, where previously checks and balances would have been in place to stop them, because often they weren't at all points powerful enough to have appointed all the judiciary or to have corrupted every single system. That is something that happens after being in power for a while. So often initial attempts to take over are thwarted by other checks and balances. This allows them to use their initial popularity in the moment to remove the rights that protect people in the long term from those forms of authoritarianism, which is why this is a right that ought not apply and you ought not support. I'll take closing government.
Okay, regardless of the pardon being successfully voted for or not, the process of the national referendum triggers more discussion and transparency because people will try to uphold the conviction and people will try to justify its own action. Isn't that benefit worth it for transparency?
So, I agree that it would be good to have democratic discussions at these things, but the question you must ask, Speaker, is was there a dearth of discussion about January 6th or about Bolsonaro's coup in 2022? Obviously, these are very prominent media events that large numbers of people have very strong thoughts on and are likely to be litigated to death. And we think, for example, coverage of these trials would also generate that same amount of transparency and that same benefit, but with the benefit of actual experts adjudicating fact and law rather than public voting on the basis of whether they like the politician or dislike the politician when the relevant question is have they violated the law. We identify a range of bad practical consequences as well. The first is that people will decide these cases badly because it is very hard to ask people to disentangle their feelings of whether or not they like Trump as a politician from the question of whether or not they think Trump violated the Constitution on January 6th. Compare that to courts who make different decisions. They're not asked to evaluate whether they like Trump or not, but the letter of the law, which is far easier. Secondly, we note just in practical terms, often we recognize the importance of courts because they're able to make unpopular but correct decisions, and it's important to allow victims or defendants the right to their decision being made correctly and not on the basis of popularity. But thirdly, we explain that democratic backsliding is far more likely on side government. Proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for the fine speech, and now I'd like to invite the MG.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Gender pronoun, she or her. You can, for a POI method, you can just directly unmute yourself or raise hand, but I won't be looking at the checkbox, so if you want POI, just unmute yourself, preferably. Okay. I think we need to first characterize who are these people who are actually going to be punished for these political crimes at the end of the day. We think that these people that are going to be firstly punished is the minority. The minority voice politicians are the victims of these punishments that are very unjust and unrightful towards these people. OG is fair, saying on whistleblowers, etc. But CG will be more relevant, talking about how minority politicians and the opposition of the majority of the government is the one that is going to be the most the most disenfranchised from these types of government on the side of opposition, right? Things like minority politicians such as Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib from the US face these political crimes and unjust treatments due to their advocacy for more marginalized groups. Things like pro-Palestine stance. Similarly, things like Black politicians who speak out against police brutality or the systemic racism that they face frequently, and they inherently are seen as someone that is more aggressive because they probably are doing things more like riots, probably doing things more like asking for a ceasefire, which is deemed anti-Semitic. These types of problems that they currently face is the characterization that we deem as things that is very important, and that's why the distinction from CG from OG, right? What is how then we are going to fix those problems in the very first place? Because things like direct democracy, serves as a check on these political elites, right? That what's to say, like, these political elites are the ones that are going to change the people's perception, for example. These minority politicians are targeted by these political elites and powerful interest groups who view their advocacy as a threat, or they are deemed as someone of a scapegoat. So these elites use these things to criminalize and marginalize these politicians, right? This national referendum empowers these general public to act as a check on these elites at the end of the day, right? This allows these citizens to then overturn these unjust convictions or by pardoning them at the end of the day. And then secondly, this also can challenge the practices often faced by racism, for example, towards these minority groups, which includes things like being vilified or unfairly persecuted, right? But then OG also said that, like, people are going to be more reliable than not. They have some public education, but this is like extremely low mechanisms from OG, right? We are going to explain it more on CG. First, people are inherently rational. Informed voters won't pardon a convicted war criminal, right? Things like people have a lot of access to information. People have access to information through various sources, things like journalism or like news outlets, social media. This means that voters are informed about political issues and the moral implications of pardoning certain crimes, especially when those crimes are also affecting the masses and their life in itself. News always want to cover a lot of angles, videos, and perceptions from neutral experts. If there's treason or huge disruptive event, especially when it affects most of the people in those countries, for example, right? And then secondly, things like experts and news and also journalism, they want to inform the most to gain popularity and also credibility. This means that they regularly contribute to the public discourse through those media outlets, informing these people about what they're actually pardoning these people for example. And then thirdly, the opposition, for example, towards Trump, the opposition towards Bolsonaro will also want to inform the society of the harms that these politicians have done to uphold their punishment at the end of the day, right? So Democrats would want to inform the American society to make sure that people won't pardon the worst criminals, right? And then also nextly, things like an upcoming national referendum triggers also discussion, like the referendum for independence, for Scottish independence from the UK in 2014, for example. This means that doing these types of referendum, there's going to be a significant public debate that's going to happen in TV, forums, etc. Those discourses then makes it likely for these people to not fall for what OOF stated about. What is it then? Our extension was this then on the principle of democracy, because we know things like whistleblowing, espionage, treason, etc. is going to affect most people and is going to inherently affect the masses of the people in the current area, right? It's going to affect the public. This means that it directly affects the masses. Therefore, people have the right to actually pardon these people at the end of the day. And we already explained to you why they will pardon those worst crimes at the end of the day. But yes, I will take one POI from opening.
Would it be easier to convince the majority of Americans who happen to watch Fox News that AOC is a treasonous communist, or to convince a panel of independent judges?
I think the public knows inherently what's best for them, because if they were to pardon those worst crimes at the end of the day, it's going to affect their livelihood as well, right? So thus convincing the people won't be inherently something that's super difficult, right? Thus actually, was it then best for the democracy and best for the people to actually vote for these crimes, right? Because we think that it's principally normal, like any other existing lock mechanisms that currently happens in the current status quo. You have the principle to actually justify and clarify your actions on the reasons why you do those actions at the very first place, or do those political crimes, right? And then they also have the right to defend themselves. Things like appeals, retrials, paroles, or early release programs exist at the end of the day, or things even like judicial reviews also exist in the current status quo to pardon these people that have to justify and clarify their actions towards the people, right? What is then these types of pardoning by these national referendum is just an added mechanisms towards those existing mechanisms that currently exist, right? What is then the benefits of having a national referendum? We don't think that national referendum would pardon regardless of the pardoning or not. There's going to be discussions happening, right? Discussion about political crimes. This means that these people would have will broaden the conversation that happens when this national referendum is happening. It necessitates the public debate. The debate goes beyond the specific of the crime itself, but also prompting discussions about broader issues such as political corruption or things like abuse of power or like racisms from those minorities, for example, and the treatment of these minority politicians. Right, this increases awareness and also is in line with the democracy of the people, and also then this also then comes to the POI that my whip has given about transparency, right? Because this encourages then individuals who have been hesitant to come forward with informations about political crimes, for example, they may feel supported for doing so, right? This referendum creates an environment where, for example, these whistleblowers are more likely to speak out, knowing that their revelations will contribute to an ongoing public debate and lead to a broader change towards the society, and also putting out all of the things that is wrong inherently within the government, for example. So proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for the fine speech. I'd now like to invite the MO.
Can you hear and see me?
Yes.
Things in this speech. First, a little bit of framing. Secondly, how this increases the mental fatigue and the impacts of individual people in the state. And lastly, how it just weakens the system. The first thing on framing is I just want to note that there are often two types or like two main categories of where treason and sedition and espionage and these political crimes fall into. And they're either for like individualized personal gain, which is often the examples that have already been brought up in the debate, such as Trump and January 6th. But they're often are also for the gain of a foreign nation. Often, like other foreign nations have active incentives to put people in foreign countries as, like, I guess, agents to commit treason, to commit espionage in order to reflect power dynamics and exert a level of social and political control over these. Often these people are influential or powerful figures that are backed by their host countries and so forth. I also want to note in framing that the people that, like, government never clarifies how national referendums are actually going to be held or what they're actually going to be look like, as a other than OG just saying it's going to be about 50% of people. Because I want to note that national referendums are held by the government of that country, and so if that government is corrupt, then is that likely that that national referendum is also corrupt? So this debate narrows down into countries that are going to hold national referendums that actually reflect and actually reflect the people that they choose. But they also do not discuss, like, I guess, the rollout of that national referendum or if it's mandatory or not, which also impacts the way that this does. I also need to note that on, like, I guess, the side of the House where this is not a national referendum, most political crimes are often kept under wraps as much as possible because they often are related to state secrets and things that are crucial to states' application of democracy and so forth. Firstly, why this increases like impacts to the ordinary person. And I just want to start this by framing by saying that most people are already kind of disengaged with news in the world around them. They kind of can like see that the world around them is quite bad. A lot of people in Australia have stopped watching the news because they do not want to be fed things that just make them like miserable about their lives. But there's also like quite a rampant amount of paranoia on personal safety and state security. That's why you see a lot of countries in the world sliding into authoritarianism and a lot of like national first rhetoric being used in a lot of places. A lot of people are concerned about the threats that other countries pose on them, are concerned about their borders, and are concerned about the everyday safety of their lives and so forth. This means they're far more likely to buy into populist rhetoric or things that promise to retain that their individual safety and their way of life over, I guess, like other things like data and so forth. This is incredibly important to note because in order for government to get any of their benefits, like there has to be quite a large amount of national referendums to be held. Otherwise, the people that they claim, to have the access of optionality to leave will not have that optionality to go for. And all of the stuff on governmental accountability in the way that they apparently like change the way they persecute people also don't unlock if you do not have a mass amount of national referendums, if you do not have these people on the front stage. national referendums are heavily published and heavily publicized. You have large marketing schemes. You have a lot of discussion on television. You have it being like quite the front page of news and in newspapers. And this can be utilized by parties to push personal agendas and so forth, to state that they are actively going against this person to protect national security and so forth. And so the question then is, how much discussion is too much discussion? If people are already overwhelmed and disengaged with their political system, if they're already paranoid and scared about the lives that they live and scared about what other people have as a threat to their lives, how much is too much news and how much is going to dysregulate and cause chaos within a national system? And I think when you have a lot of this disseminating news, when you have threats to your country's safety on the front page every other week, when you have newspapers and discussions talking about the threat of espionage, how someone was uncovered doing this to your country that could disintegrate the democratic pillars that you operate under. This is incredibly scary to the average person. And you should weigh this quite highly, because no one else in the debate discusses what the individual person is actually going to feel when they know that they are actively, constantly having to vote on these people. Also, that not in framing, a lot of these places are contained to other countries, or in the case of CG's case, minorities. And so when you have populist rhetoric, when you have these people associated with major crimes, that just leads to further divisions and factionalization within communities, where people look at members of a different minority party and see them as a threat to their own way of life, and see them to a threat as their own security, and start having further amounts of racial and ethnic tensions within a country, which is ultimately quite bad for an individual, far more worse for a minority who ultimately has no control over, the people of another country, or people who are highly influential and do these acts. This is incredibly bad for a state's cohesion, and this is something that you should weigh incredibly highly in this debate. I'll take a POI from opening.
Yeah, so gut check and Ob's own example, whether there's actually any confidence Trump will get convicted of treason. His Supreme Court appointees just gave him presidential immunity. This is why prosecutors are focusing on cases where they might actually secure convictions, like campaign finance with Stormy Daniels, or like business fraud overvaluing his assets.
Polls on your side, or polls in, I guess, current scheme also, even if it was put to a public vote, he literally got presidency. He looks like he potentially may win again. He probably would also, I don't understand the why it's not symmetric on your side of the house in regards to Trump. Secondly, how this just weakens the system. And note here that they never explain if it's mandatory voting or not. So I'm just going to say it for them and say that it is mandatory voting. Otherwise, they do not get to unlock any of their stuff about democratics and voter trade-offs. Firstly, just simply, referendums are fucking hard to manage and organize. You have to have a rollout across the other state. You have to coordinate large groups of people. You have to do marketing. You have to figure out the wording of the referendum that you are pushing, and so forth. And this is just an extremely resource and time-intensive process that the government has to run and operate. They have to hire these people. They have to allocate time and resource towards this national referendum. And note that it's likely to have quite a lot of national referendums, because people are going to want to opt in to potentially being pardoned, right? And so this just defocuses the government from real and pressing issues. Because if you are focusing on all of these national referendums, you probably do not have the time to continually push actual policies and laws in place. And this comes above, it's beyond whether people are correct or not in their trade-offs, because it legitimately harms the government's ability to function. This probably encourages more instances of espionage, because they know that even if they are caught, it continually hards that government's ability to have to conduct democracy. It continually weakens them in the sense of what they can and cannot control. It weakens their ability to have resource and time and economic allocations and so forth. This harms state security on a very simplistic and widespread level, and this is why you should vote off.
I'd like to thank the speaker for the fine speech. I'd now like to invite the G-Dub.
All right, I'll take a POI from OO at some point. You can just open cam or write on chat. I'll be keeping an eye on Zoom. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's quickly respond to everything from CO. First, they talk about they don't want these national referendums because it makes people miserable and there's a lot of paranoia. One, we then question, do you not also want news coverage about any political treason that happens on your side? I think, as OO already mentioned, there's still going to be a lot of coverage about January 6th, regardless of this. So I think CO is slightly knifing OO at that point. You don't want coverage. But second of all, this is symmetric on CO. Election cycles will still have massive discussion and potential of mudslinging. Midterm elections will still have a lot of discussion. If there's ongoing national disasters, fires, potential pandemics, new diseases, you will still have a lot of discussion, misery, and paranoia. Conservatives will still fearmonger on things like white replacement theories, DEI hires, etc. So we say that this is quite symmetric. I don't think CO can defend a world where suddenly people will not be miserable or paranoid at any point. And even on top of that, regardless, we say even if they're scared, they will care because this is directly affecting their own well-being, especially to the masses. So this is a worthy trade-off. Second of all, they talk about how there's a lot of referendums and they're expensive. We shouldn't do that. One, that's definitely not the burden of this debate because it happens quite rarely. I think all three teams already agree that these political crimes of this scale doesn't happen that often. Second of all, exactly because it's that costly, it will not be happening that often. Thirdly, as OO also admits, it will not be that common because they already mentioned how it is quite risky to potentially become a political criminal. That's why it will not happen. And lastly, coordinations are difficult for referendum. That's just an argument against all referendums, against all forms of national voting. It's unclear how CO wants to involve the society in this democratic process if they're so against it just for the finances. So we say, I think that takes out CO. What am I going to do then in the rest of my speech? First, let's compare ourselves with OG and then a lot of the responses to OO. I think OG did well in talking about how this is a democratic right in general, but I think CG was more engaging in our democratic principle. We were able to justify pardoning, not just the voting process or involvement of people. We already told you that in the status quo, even in OO's world, you will have other forms of pardoning. For example, you will have appeals. You can request for a retrial. You can have early release programs. You have judicial reviews. This is all because people have a right to defend themselves, and people have a right to justify and clarify their actions, whether they are whistleblowers or whether they are actual political treasoners. The weighing for this is CG was able to go over OG because we're willing to justify, even if it's a harmful action, it's normalized in the status quo to reduce your punishment one way or another. Second of all, we introduced to you the idea that the victims of these political crimes are also minority politicians. The racism that happens because black speakers of the House in the US are potentially mistargeted because their attempts of being involved in Black Lives Matter, of being involved in protests, are called out as being aggressive and dangerous towards the American democracy. Politicians like Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib in the US for being pro-Palestine, calling them anti-Semites and calling them a threat to American democracy. I think these are the victims that we were able to claim as Impact and CG, and this is over OG because this is an actor that is more vulnerable due to them having less power to defend themselves, unlike those whistleblowers who have high level information access to begin with. So we say that that I think is the first comparison towards OG. But then what is the main extension from CG? The first 4 minutes of my member speech. We characterize to you that the motion talks about we are allowing the national referendum. We don't have to defend a national referendum where you always pardon the large criminals, because I think we already told you people are rational, people can be informed voters, and we will not pardon a clear convicted war criminal. I think OJ only talks about how crime begets crimes, how you can punish these people in other ways, but that is contingent on being able to have those other crimes to begin with. CG will engage directly. Even for this one political crime, you will not get away with it, and we are able to negate OO. How are we able to explain this? We told you people are well informed and people have access to things like journalism, political experts, etc. I think OO talked about how people don't have expertise, you fall for rhetorics, and it's based on perception. We agree with that. So we say that the idea about the political referendum is that it is self-regulating. You to gain the ability to get the votes to either uphold the conviction or to apply the pardoning, you will have to have all of the actors involved, including the opposition of the evil politicians, including the journalists, including the media actors that all of my members talked about. All of them are highly, highly incented to make sure people are informed, to make sure the most egregious crimes won't be pardoned as well. I think OG mostly talks about how people are more reliable and people have some public education, but on CG we gave you far more mechanisms. We told you about one, news organizations want to cover both angles because they want perceptions for neutral experts to gain viewers from both sides. Second of all, journalists want to inform people to gain popularity and credibility on both sides of the house. Thirdly, the opposition towards Trump's, the opposition towards Bolsonaro want to give information to make sure the pardon doesn't reach the 50%. And that means that Democrats will inform the American society to counteract Fox News and the Republican side. And fifthly, we told you the fact that there is an upcoming national referendum, that is what triggers information. I think OO's first POI talks about how is it easier to punish or to inform people via the judges or the majority public? That's a fair question, but we already told you why the majority public are still not easily convinced in that way. That's why we were able to negate this. Before I move on from this,
Yeah, you make the same mistake the voters would, which is assuming that the referenda is a political question rather than a legal question. No amount of journalism will help inform a voter more than a well-trained judge. Voters can't separate themselves from their political biases.
I think that's fair, but we already told you that one, you still have a right to do, you as a society, because you're affected by whatever this treason or huge political crime is, you have a right to engage with it. Second of all, if you're not informed legally, then you can be that's exactly how you trigger people to learn more about all that legal information. Because we already told you, regardless of the outcome of the pardon, especially if, as OO says, people are not perfectly informed regarding legality, exactly the national referendum process is what opens up discourse. It's what informs people about what are the legal repercussions and the legal standards that exist. We push for more transparency on our side of the house. We push for far more education. Even if it's not going to be perfect, we have significantly more people trying to get informed, more journalists, the opposition party trying to inform the society about what are the crimes that have been done by this politician. Therefore, and how they fulfill all of these like legal requirements to get punished. Therefore, they want to make sure their society and all of their voters do not let this person get away with a pardon. So in the worst case where they are uninformed, as OO says, we inform them much better, we trigger that discussion, and we trigger the educational process necessary to gain any sort of progress in terms of legal acknowledgement. For all those reasons, proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for the fine speech. I'd now like to invite the ODub.
More questions in this speech. Firstly, do we get more accountability for government? Secondly, do we get better persecution of crimes? Thirdly, are the voters or the government the better choice to enact or to pardon? And lastly, is more discussion good? Firstly, do we get more accountability for governments? Because this is a push that was done by OG. And the first thing I just want to know, I think we've already kind of covered that if you have a lack of accountability in the government standard, then you are likely to have a lack of accountability when you push forward a national referendum. And so it's unlikely that this debate takes place in places where you have a government that is already corrupt or in a government that already has a lack of accountability. And so this just kind of falls out of the debate at that point when the government that we're talking about already have checks and balances in place. The second thing is, do we just a better persecution of crimes? Because another point pushed by opening government was just that you now have more, thought behind when you persecute a crime, because now you know that if you wrongly persecute, they now have the optionality to go for a national referendum, which is, quite a big deal, and so you'd want to avoid it. And this just means that there is I guess, a higher burden of proof in the judiciary system. The first thing I want to point is it already gives a bunch of mechanisms why this is unlikely to be the case. They say that proving this is already hard in the status quo, that these are quite large crimes, that these often take a lot of time to prove and a lot of time to work through. And so it is far more likely that even in status quo, that these crimes are not persecuted quite lightly. The second thing that they never prove to you why this better persecution or like this optionality for, I guess, these people who are persecuted badly is actually likely to eventuate, why the persecution, I guess, like why national referendums would be so successful that in I guess absolving people who have lower I guess crimes against the state to actually leave, which just harms their case entirely if the government has no incentive to persecute, I guess, lesser. And lastly, that even if everything was true, the fact that they are now pushing for or like advocating for the falsely pardoning or the falsely persecution of incredibly dangerous and influential people is incredibly large of a threat to state governments and just means that these people can continue to weaken and harm the government threat. And this is something that you should weigh highly. Thirdly, are voters the better choices? And this is down GovBench, which is basically like we prefer voters as the better actor in making this decision to a government. But they never actually prove why voters are better actors, other than just kind of touting the fact of democracy and voters deserve to make their own trade-offs, ignoring the fact that there are many trade-offs made every day that voters do not make, and that is why we have elected officials that make those choices with us as a proxy. Cool. They say that they're far better actors because they should be allowed to make this democratic trade-off. They mitigate, I guess, any idea that these voters would be kind of bad by just saying that they will be informed, they will be educated, but they never explain to us where this education and where this information is coming from. If the society at large, or if the government that I guess like is elected by that society and it has judiciary and educational powers that mean that it's often influencing society at large. You have a community in a state, has put these people in, has persecuted these people in prison. That is unlikely that the information, the education that you're getting as an individual of that state is defined and informed by that state in and of itself. So it's unlikely to see why you would be choosing a different pathway than you have been taught to do. If a state is persecuting a minority on the minority basis, and you're a person of that state and you're getting information from that state, you are likely to still opt into persecuting that minority because you have not been able to access information otherwise. You are informed by the society that you live in. Unlikely, like they never prove to us why voters can actually make that trade-off or how they're accessing information that allows them to do so. They say, people are rational. People can make good decisions for themselves. People act in the interest of the public. But we see every day that voters do not always act in the interest of the public or even themselves because they are often larger than things that they are scared of, that they fear, that or certain rhetoric that they buy into that influence the way that they perceive the world and the influence that the ways that make decisions. For example, in America, a lot of low-income white families will still vote for policies that put tax cuts or take away Medicare that directly impacts their lives, but is told to them by a person that they trust, or is touted to them by their community, or is influenced by the traditions that they've always been a Republican family, or is just influenced by the fact that they idealize being in that tax bracket or being in that position of life of the people that vote for these tax cuts. That means that they embolize and they reflect those decision-making skills. Obviously, people can be rational, but it is often the case that people are manipulated by those in authority, that people trust other people's opinions above their own, and people make decisions that are, again, public interest. So they have been unable to prove why voters are the better actors in this case. On our side, we prove to you why national referendums weaken the system just by sheer usage of resources and taxes. They claim that obviously there's not going to be as many national referendums as I would like to claim. There's still going to be more, referendums, like even if there's just an extra one a year, the last referendum that we had in Australia had a year-long marketing campaign. That is still an incredibly large amount of resources that is designated by the government. That is still large amount of time of political airtime, political like lobbying, like lawmakers and so forth that are dedicated to this national referendum, to establishing this vote. And this is all time, money, resources, energy that should probably be, utilized for the actual beneficiaries of the larger citizens in that country. And this is something that you should weigh incredibly highly, because these citizens are obviously the most important part of the debate. This is their state. This is their democracy at risk, and you should be able to protect their ability to actually raise in life. Last point then is just on discussion, because I said that it is currently overwhelming, the political nature, and a lot of people, especially in America, are disengaged and disassociated from the political structures because of just how miserable it is. And the only response I get from CG is, oh, they're miserable already, so it doesn't really matter. But they do the work for me, and they say that there's going to be so much more education, that they're going to be taught what crimes are good or not, that there's going to be legal requirements that are fostered upon them for them to understand, which just further capitulates the overwhelming, encompassing nature of policies, and also the lack of ability to actually do anything meaningful. Your vote seems to count for nothing. You just further entrench yourself in political disassociation. This is incredibly negative. Proud to oppose.